It is our great pleasure today to welcome Chantal Thompson, who is a teaching professor of French and an ACTFL trainer. Madame Thompson has degrees from Brigham Young University, a bachelor's degree and master's degree, as well as Université de Rennes. I'm sorry, I'm a Portuguese speaker, so in France. She is the author of a number of texts, including Ensuite and, again, I'm going to slaughter this moment, littéraire. Thank you. An anthology, 1992. She's the coordinator of first-year courses at BYU, the recipient of numerous teaching awards, which I can verify. I've had a number of her students in my classes and speak glowingly of Professor Thompson. She specializes in first and second year instruction and teaches French 326 phonetics as well as African literature. The title for today's lecture is Ambiguous Adventure of Africa. We would now like to turn the time over to Madame Thompson.
Thank you very much. I'm wearing a boubou, which is African traditional dress from Senegal. And the reason I titled my lecture Africa's Ambiguous Adventure is because I want to use a lot of what Cheikh Hamidou Kane, a Senegalese author who's going to be on our campus next week, has written about Africa's ambiguous adventure. This is the French version. This is the English version. I've ordered 20 copies of the English version at the bookstore. They should be there by the end of this week or early next week for sure. Why is Africa's destiny ambiguous? Well, how many of you know quite a bit about Africa? Not too many. Okay. So we'll start from scratch. I would say my answer to why is Africa's adventure ambiguous is because it has had to live with more scars than any other continent on the face of the earth. And because for 4 centuries it has been forced to live by sets of values that were not its own. That would make anybody's life ambiguous. Alexander Morrison, in his book, The Dawning of a Brighter Day, The Church in Black Africa, refers to Africa as the giant behind the veil. The giant, that's easy to understand. Okay? It occupies 20% of the Earth's land surface. It is 4 times larger than the U.S. It has twice as many people, divided in 2,000 tribes and ethnic groups. But guess how much of the GNP of the world it can claim? Guess. 1%. Okay. So it's a giant. It's a big giant. Why is it behind the veil? Well, because most people know so little about Africa. What do most people know about Africa? The land of safaris. Well, I hate to break the news to you, but safaris only occur in a very limited part of Africa, and it really doesn't represent Africa. The mistake of most European colonizers is that they assumed that Africa was a tabula rasa, a piece of soft clay that could be shaped into a Western look-alike vase. And that's what they tried to do. But Africa had its own past, a very rich past. It has a very rich history of empires, such as the Empire of Mali, which covers part of current Mali, but covered most of West Africa, or the Songhai Empire. And it has a record of having organized states powerful enough to exploit their own resources, control their own trade, and have a professional army and a civil service with provincial governors. back in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. So Africa came with a past, but when the Europeans came, they didn't take that into consideration. What went wrong for Africa? I would say one of the main things that went wrong is that they did not have a written heritage. And you can see why it was so important for Nephi to go get the plates of Laban, for the people to have a record. Most African people did not have a record. Therefore, they were vulnerable. They were vulnerable to the Europeans who started arriving in the early 1500s, late 1400s, early 1500s. Another factor, the hostile climate. A lot of Africa has a climate that is not too user-friendly. Okay. Also, because of the climate, the blight of disease, such as malaria, yellow fever, etc., etc. Diarrheal diseases are estimated to kill over 2 million African children each year. I took a group of BYU students to Senegal a year and a half ago. We taught literacy in a little village for 3 weeks. We got really close to those people, especially the women and the children. I went back last May to visit that village. Out of that group of children that we taught, 8 had died during the rain season. 8 of the children that I knew had died during the rain season of mostly malaria or diarrheal diseases. In rural areas, 80% of the people in Africa lack ready access to clean, safe water. If we could just get clean, safe water to Africa, we would cut those death tolls in such large proportions. Malaria is estimated to kill 1 million African children each year. Hundreds of thousands of children still die of measles, polio, and other common childhood diseases that we have vaccines for each year. Infant mortality rates are 10 to 20 times higher in Black Africa than in Western countries. Also AIDS, over 23 million people in sub-Saharan Africa are HIV positive. And it is estimated that approximately 13.7 million Africans have already died of AIDS in recent years. Life expectancy in Africa, what would you say? Guess. 40 to 50. Okay, average. Another factor that explains the breakdown is the number of ethnic groups with their own language, their own culture, and the lack of communication. And finally, and that's the biggest one, what went wrong? Slavery and colonialism. Let's talk about slavery just for a little bit. When did the European traders start coming to the coast of West Africa? As I said, the late 1400s. What were they after? Diamonds in the south, yes. Gold, and well, anything they could find, and slaves. The Arabs had been coming to Black Africa for quite a while to get black slaves. And why did the Europeans want slaves? They didn't bring them into Europe. Why did they want them? To take them to the plantations in the New World. And so this was called the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the New World, because they were planting sugarcane in the New World, and they needed laborers, manpower. It is estimated that between the early 1500s and 1815, when the slave trade was officially abolished, about 100 million slaves. This is mind-boggling. We think of the concentration camps, 5 or 6 million people. We think of that as the ultimate. Think of this. About 100 million slaves were taken from Africa. And not all were sent to the New World because they were first brought to those fortresses on the coasts, mostly on the coasts of West Africa, and stocked in fortresses where about 25% of them died. From lack of care, they gave them just one meal a day because they wanted to see who would be able to survive that kind of treatment. And so the weaker ones would die, and they were pretty sure they had the stronger ones left. Okay, and there were other causes of death in those fortresses. And then another 25% would die on the ships. And if we could turn on the overhead projector, I have a transparency of how, and this transparency dates to the 17th century. Okay, this drawing. It shows how the slaves were transported on those ships. If you've seen the movie Amistad, it's a pretty realistic portrayal of how the slaves were treated on those ships. But on a lot of ships, they would actually put the head of one way and the head of the other one the other way, so that they could put 2 or 3 more per row, and they could not move. Imagine 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks on the sea in those conditions. No wonder that 20 to 25% didn't make it. Okay, and then after in 1880, after slavery, there was colonialism. After the slave trade was abolished, the Europeans started making colonies all over Africa, and then we can put the other map, the map. What was colonialism? It was the Europeans imposing their way of life and their institutions with no or little consideration for cultural identity and boundaries, leading to a very ambiguous situation. In 1885, at the Berlin Treaty in Berlin, the European bureaucrats met. Not one of them had been to Africa. Okay? They met with a map of Africa, and they carved out nations by drawing lines on that map without any reference to ethnicities of the people involved, cultures, or whatever. They said, okay, you take this one, you take that one. And this is how we have Africa today, still. Even since independence, mostly in 58, 59, 60, all the African countries became independent. They have kept those borders because they were there. But those are artificial borders. And it was like England, France, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, and Spain dividing up the continent like poker players sharing a pot. That's how Africa was divided. We can turn off the projector. Colonization also meant missionary work. And this is what the Christians taught. That the blacks were a cursed race who had black skin because they were hell-bound. But if they obeyed the whites, the hell they were going to would be a lesser hell. Therefore, you had to obey the whites who were the saviors of the black race. Hallelujah. That's what they were taught. No wonder so many Africans turned to Islam in the 18th and the 19th century, especially in the 19th century. What kind of Christian example did they have in a lot of places? Colonization was in full swing from 1880 until the late 1950s. As I said, a conquest through institutions such as schools, and mostly schools, but also the legal system, the administration, and so forth. But the schools are the most powerful way to conquer a people. And this is what happens in the book, The Ambiguous Adventure. Okay, I'm going to give you a little background on the author. And as I said, he's coming next week to BYU. I know a lot of universities all over this world who have been trying for years to get Cheikh Hamidou Kane to come. He's 74 years old. He's one of the great thinkers and writers of our time. He doesn't travel much, but he's coming to BYU. And he's going to give a keynote address as part of the colloquium. Oh, let's see. Is it on? Okay. All right. We're having on March 7th a colloquium, and you've probably seen these flyers all over the place, on revealed religion in Africa, Christianity and Islam, and he's going to be the keynote speaker. He's a very devout Muslim and a very profound thinker, and his address should be absolutely marvelous. We're also going to have Elder Glenn Pace, who is going to talk to us at 3 o'clock on our church in Africa. And all the other speakers are very well known in their field. Okay? No, it's not working. Well, okay, here it works. Cheikh Hamidou Kane, that's how you spell his name, is the author of L'Aventure Ambiguë, or Ambiguous Adventure, that he published in 1961. He wrote it about 10 years before and thought it was just, oh, I'm supposed to stay there? Okay. And thought that it was just his own journal. But he let a few friends read it, and they said, oh, this has got to be published. And it was published in 61. It won all kinds of international prizes. It is one of the masterpieces of world literature. If you have not read Ambiguous Adventure, get a copy. Read it. It's a book that's going to change your life. It's not a book that you can just zoom through, because every word makes you think. But it's a marvelous book that will make you rethink your faith, your relationship with God, your relationship with the world, a lot of interesting things. Okay, Cheikh Hamidou Kane, as it shows there, is an author, a philosopher, a diplomat, a minister. He was Minister of Development in the government of Senegal when it became a republic. He was asked to become the vice president of Senegal under Léopold Sédar Senghor, the first president, and he refused because he would have had to compromise some principles. He chose exile for 13 years rather than compromise his principles. He was being asked to do some dishonest things in that government. When the situation was cleared, he came back and was immediately put back as a minister, and he remained a minister until he retired in 1988. Yeah. Okay, and he's published another book in 1995, okay, The Keepers of the Temple, and he is really himself a keeper of faith and values, a defender of the spiritual amidst the clamors of the material, and a politician, as I mentioned. Okay, this is when he's speaking. He's going to speak in French on Wednesday, the 6th of March, asking the question, is Africa's adventure still ambiguous? And so we'll have his own answer there. And then his keynote address, Islamic Dialogue with the World, a West African Perspective. Okay. Now, let's go to the book, because this is wonderful. Okay. In this book, you have a young boy who happens to be the author, who grows up in eastern Senegal, which was well, the Muslims came very early in that part of Senegal, probably between the 9th and the 11th century. So it's an enclave of Senegal that has been Muslim for a long, long time. The rest of Senegal has been Muslim. 98% of them are Muslim in there. only since the 19th century. But for this particular part of Senegal, it's been a lot longer. So you have the young boy, who's about 6 years old, going to Quranic school. And when he's 6 or 7, the colonizers, the French, build a school in the region. And so a decision has to be made. Are the children going to be sent to the white school? And so the people in the leadership positions are very aware that if the children go to the school, there is a risk. There's a big risk. They may lose their traditions. They may lose a lot of things. Okay? And so this is the teacher of the Quranic school talking about colonization and the white school. If God has assured their victory over us, it is apparently because we, who are his zealots, have offended him. That's how he interprets it. You can see the fatalism of a lot of Muslims here. I have learned that in the country of the white man, the revolt against poverty and misery is not distinguished from the revolt against God. They say that the movement is spreading and that soon in the world that same cry against poverty will drown out the voice of the muezzins. Muezzin is the one who calls for prayer at the mosque. It is certain that their school is the better teacher of how to join wood to wood, or how to build things, and that men should learn how to construct dwelling houses that resist the weather. I know also that he, meaning God, must be saved. We must build solid dwellings for men, true, but within those dwellings, we must save God. And so what do they see as the danger of the white culture coming in? The white culture emphasizes the material things, the economy, building things, producing. But what happens? What's the trade-off? When you think too much of the material things, you lose God. And he is referring here to the Industrial Revolution in Europe in the 19th century and the rise of socialism and communism, which did happen. When people started thinking too much about the welfare of man, they forgot God. Okay? And so a decision has to be made. Now this is a dialogue between the teacher of the Quranic school, the one who's so concerned about the children keeping their faith, and the chief of the people, the Dialobé, who doesn't know what to do. He's really at a loss. This is what the chief says. If I told them to go to the new school, they would go, because I'm the chief. They would learn all the ways of joining wood to wood, which we do not know. Building things the modern way. But learning, they would also forget. Would what they would learn be worth as much as what they would forget? Interesting question. Can one learn this without forgetting that? And is what one learns worth what one forgets? Very interesting question for all of Africa, as a matter of fact. It's not just a matter of religion. It's all the traditions, all the way of life. The rest of the quote. At the glowing hearth, which is the Quranic school, what we teach the children is God. What they forget is themselves, their bodies, and the futile dream which hardens with age and stifles the spirit. So what they learn is worth infinitely more than what they forget. And the chief says, if they do not go, their houses will fall into ruins. Extreme poverty will be entrenched among them, and their hearts will be filled with resentment. You see the ambiguity of the situation. Having to choose between two sets of values, having to be an ambiguous person. And then the chief's sister is going to come, and she's a very decisive lady. Her brother has a hard time making decisions. She doesn't. Okay? And she tries to explain why and how the Africans were defeated by the whites. 100 years ago, our grandfather and the elite of the country with him was defeated. Why? How? Only the newcomers know. We must ask them. We must go and learn from them the art of conquering without being in the right. The art of conquering without being in the right. Furthermore, the conflict has not yet ceased. The foreign school is the new form of the war, which those who have come here are waging. And we must send our elite there, expecting that all the country will follow them. So why does she want to send the children to the white school, knowing that what they're going to learn there is diametrically opposed to what they've been taught before and what they're still being taught by their families and their faith? Here she recalls what she calls the morning of the Occident, when the whites came. Strange dawn. The morning of the Occident in black Africa was spangled over with smiles, with cannon shots, with shining glass beads. Those who had no history, as perceived by the whites, of course. Okay? Those who had no history, the blacks, were encountering those who carried the world on their shoulders, so they said. From shock, the one side made no resistance. The deed was accomplished before the people were even conscious of what had happened. Where the newcomers had brought disorder, they established a new order, the colonial order. They destroyed and they constructed. On the black continent, it began to be understood that their true power lay not in the cannons of the first morning, but rather in what followed the cannons. The new school shares at the same time the characteristics of cannon and of magnet. From the cannon, it draws its efficacy as an arm of combat. Better than the cannon, it makes conquest permanent. The cannon compels the body, the school bewitches the soul. And that's the way you had little African children learning from French history books, for example, and 22 countries in Africa were former French colonies. 22 countries out of 50 have French as their official language to this day. In those schools, what did they learn? My ancestors, the Gauls, had blue eyes and blonde hair. That's what they learned. That's how school molds the minds. And that's how you start having an ambiguous identity. Who are you? You're obviously not a descendant of the Gauls with blue eyes and blonde hair. Yet you've been taught that. Who are you? The ambiguous identity of Africa. The knight is the little boy's father. He fears for his son. He knows that they're about to decide whether to send the children to the white school or not. And he fears. And he's a very intelligent and philosophical man. Those who, even down to his own family, who were racing headlong into the future, if they could only understand that their son was a mirage. See, here they are about to send the children to the white school and teach the white ways to the Africans. But the Western sun is a mirage. Why? In truth, it is not acceleration which the world needs. And what comes with modern things? Acceleration. The night reflected. What we must have is a bed upon which, stretched out, the soul will determine a respite in the name of its salvation. Civilization is an architecture of responses. Man is born to a forest of questions. But is man's slavery amid a forest of solutions worth anything more? Happiness is not a function of the mass of responses, and our modern world is always out to find new solutions to all the problems, right? But what do we find ourselves doing in the process? Running crazy. Do you ever feel like you're running crazy? Is man's slavery amid a forest of solutions worth the stress, the running, forgetting the important things? Happiness is not a function of the mass of responses, but of their distribution. There must be balance. But the West is possessed by its own compulsion, and the world is becoming westernized. So he sees that as a danger. If all our children go to the white school, they'll start living like the whites. They'll start rushing through everything, living in a world of stress. They'll forget God. And when you forget God, nothing else matters. So now we have a dialogue between the knight, the father of the little boy, and Paul Lacroix, who's the French school teacher. And the interesting thing here is that this conversation happens at twilight. And so the two men are in this room, and the knight is wearing a white boo-boo, kind of like this, and very regal looking. He's a very tall man, very noble. And there is this setting sun shedding light in the room, but not enough. And the white man wants to turn on the light. He wants to turn on the light. He wants to see. And he's going to tell the African man that light is what this life is all about. Okay? Finding light and man finding all the solutions to all the problems in the world. And the African man is the one who feels at ease in the shadows and who's going to tell him the problem with the West is that you want too much light. And the light shed by man, not by God. You have to learn to live in the shadows of faith in order to really have balance. Okay? He says, your science has revealed to you a round and perfect world, an infinite movement, said the knight. It has reconquered that world from chaos, but I believe that in so doing it has laid you open for despair. Not at all, says the white man. Okay? It has liberated us from fears, childish and absurd fears. Absurd? What is absurd? Is the world which does not end. As for us, we still believe in the coming of truth. We hope for it. Oh, as for us, we conquer a little more of truth each day, thanks to science. God doesn't have anything to do with truth. And so you can see where they're going with this. And the African man says, evidence is a quality of the surface. Your science is the triumph of evidence, a proliferation of the surface. It makes you the masters of the external, but at the same time, it exiles you there more and more. I have sent my son, by now it's been done, okay? He's going to the white school. I've sent my son to the school because the external which you have checked was slowly seeping through us and destroying us. Teach him to check the external, okay? He needs to know that. The external is aggressive. If man does not conquer it, then it destroys man and makes him a victim of tragedy. A sore which is neglected does not heal, but becomes infected to the point of gangrene. A child who is not educated goes backward. But every hour that passes brings a supplement of ignition to the crucible in which the world is being fused. We have not had the same past, you and ourselves. Yes, but we shall have strictly the same future. The era of separate destinies has run its course. Monsieur Lacroix, this future, I accept it. My son is the pledge of that. He will contribute to its building. But it is my wish that he contribute not as a stranger come from distant regions, but as an artisan responsible for the destinies of the citadel. And the white man says, he will teach us the secrets of the shade? And he knows that he's just being ironical. I know that you do not believe in the shade. And the shade here represents the world of faith, when you can't prove everything. Okay? What you do not see does not exist. The moment, like a raft, carries you on the luminous surface of its round disk, and you deny the abyss that lies about you. The future citadel, thanks to my son, will open its wide windows onto that abyss. With all my soul, I wish for this opening, meaning the shedding of shadows and shade onto the Western light of reason. And so what happens is that they go, Samba Diallo, the hero, the protagonist, goes to school. He goes to elementary school. Then he goes to high school in Dakar, the capital of Senegal. And then he goes to Paris to do a degree in philosophy and law. Philosophy is very dangerous. Do we have any philosophy majors here? Philosophy is very dangerous for one who has an ambiguous adventure. Philosophy teaches you that reason can prove anything and everything. And the knight knows the danger of studying philosophy in the West. The West began timidly by relegating God to a place between quotation marks. Then 2 centuries later, having acquired more assurance, they decreed God is dead, the Industrial Revolution. From that day dates the era of frenzied toil. Nietzsche is the contemporary of the Industrial Revolution. God was no longer there to measure and justify man's activity, but already this phase is past. After the death of God, what they are now announcing is the death of man. At the same time that work gets along without human life, machine replacing man, at that same time it ceases to make human life its final aim. It ceases to value man. Man has never been so unhappy as at this moment when he is accumulating so much. Why? Because what counts in the Western world is light and light only, the light of reason. What can be proven, what can be supported with statistics. The shade or the shadow of faith cannot be proven in the same way. In Paris, while he's a student there in philosophy, some friends of his ask him, why are you doing a degree in philosophy? Okay, what are you going to do with it? And he says, they say, you intend to teach? Perhaps I shall teach. Everything will depend on what will have happened to me by the time I reach the end of my studies. You know, the fate of us Negro students is a little like that of a courier. At the moment of leaving home, we do not know whether we shall ever return. And what does that return depend on? It may be that we shall be captured at the end of our itinerary, vanquished by our adventure itself. And this is the ambiguous adventure defined. It suddenly occurs to us that all along our road, we have not ceased to how do you pronounce that? Metamorphose? Okay, metamorphose ourselves, and we see ourselves as other than what we were. Sometimes the metamorphosis is not even finished. We have turned ourselves into hybrids, and there we are left. And this is not just for Africans in the diaspora. It's Africans in Africa. Because when they go to the city, what rules the city? The white values. The white administration, even since independence. The white ways of doing things. And so you become a hybrid. You're in between 2 identities. And the next quote explains a little more. It's still Samba Diallo, the protagonist, talking to some other friends who are black, but who have always lived in France. It still seems to me that in coming here I've lost a privileged mode of acquaintance, the faith mode, the shadows. In former times the world was not silent and neuter, it was alive. Here now the world is silent and there is no longer any resonance from myself. I'm like a broken balafon. It's like a xylophone. Like a musical instrument that has gone dead. I have the impression that nothing touches me anymore. I am not a distinct country of the Diallo Bay, meaning I am not a distinct African, facing a distinct Occident and appreciating with a cool head what I must take from it and what I must leave with it by way of counterbalance. I have become the two. There is not a clear mind deciding between the two factors of a choice. There is a strange nature in distress over not being two. And that's the ambiguous adventure of Africa. It's a beautiful way to put it. At the very end of the book, he starts losing his faith in Paris. Studying the philosophers and the ways of the world, he starts losing his faith. What the father had feared is coming to pass. And feeling that his son is in distress, the father writes a letter to his son and says, "Come home. I know it's not the end of the school year, but this is more serious. Come home." When you start losing God, it's more serious than any degree. And so he comes home, and there is a misunderstanding between him and the madman of the village. And the madman of the village, thinking that Samba Diallo is refusing to pray, and he really isn't. He doesn't want to be forced to pray, but he's asking God, "Please help me come back to you." The madman misinterprets what he's saying and kills him. So Samba Diallo dies at the end of the book. A lot of people say, why did he have Samba Diallo die? So many articles have been written about the end of that book. So much ink has been poured over that ending. And I would have to say that I disagree with most of what has been written over that ending. Because if you look at Cheikh Hamidou Khan's life, what did he do? He got his degree in France. He came back. He did experience a personal crisis and a crisis with his faith. But he came back, and he came back as a very strong person who was able to help rebuild his country and went to work in economic matters and the things of the white world, if we may say so. And in the last chapter, there's a voice that speaks to Samba, who is dead. It can be God. It can be his alter ego. We're not sure who it is. Okay, it says, "Be attentive. See what brings about the great reconciliation. The light stirs the darkness. Be attentive, for see, you are reborn to being when you are able to solve the ambiguous adventure. When you're able to keep the temple of faith within the good things of the modern world. If Africa manages to do that, Africa will make it. If Africa just imitates the Western world, Africa will not make it. There is no more light and there is no more weight, and the darkness is no more. It's no longer a matter of light or darkness. Wisdom, it's a matter of wisdom. Singular light of the depths. Be attentive. You're entering the place where there is no ambiguity. Behold the moment over which you reign." We could talk for hours about what that could mean. But what happens, because it's time, I had more to say. When you look at the literature, this came out in 61. His second book came out in 95. When you look at the literature of the late 1990s and even the early 2000s, what do we see? We see still people talking about the ambiguous adventure because Africa is still experiencing this ambiguity. And I hope that this presentation has helped you understand the ambiguity of being an African in today's world. Thank you very much. We can have a few questions if you wish. No?